In Luke the 15th chapter. And Luke the 15th chapter, the parables within that chapter are known as the lost parables. And we're going to be talking about mostly the prodigal son. You know, the gospel of grace tells us that God loves the entire world, and He is not willing that any should perish. The message of the gospel found within the Scriptures also tells us that through Jesus Christ, all humanity can experience reconciliation. We can read the story of the prodigal son, the son of the rich man who desired his entire inheritance. This son approaches his father and he makes his desire known. Now understand, this is not a simple request. It's much more involved than we may first consider. You see, because what the younger son is doing here, that prodigal son is doing, he's asking his father to have his will put into effect. In other words, to have himself declared legally dead. To be considered legally dead, that the son might have his inheritance. And yet, surprisingly, we find that the father is willing to honor his son's request. The younger son is given his inheritance, and presumably the elder son as well is given what is his in the estate. In Luke 15, verse 11, Jesus speaking to his audience 2,000 years ago, but to speaking to each one of us today, Christians throughout the ages and any and all, we read, "A certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the portion of my inheritance that belongs to me.' And he," that is the father, "divided them his living." Now what the father has done, he has bequeathed to his sons everything that he is able. In the Greek, it uses the word ton bion. That means that he has poured out his entire being. Everything he had, what amounted to being his life, was poured out in that inheritance to his sons. He's poured out his life, so to speak, having himself legally considered dead. Now after the sons have received their inheritance, the younger one, he then removes himself from the family estate and he ventures out into a far country. In other words, he leaves home and he goes into this far country and he engages in a lifestyle of gratification. In verse 13 it says, "Not many days after," that is, not many days after receiving his inheritance, "the younger son gathered all together everything that was his, and he took his journey into a far country. And there he wasted his substance with riotous living." This riotous living that the son engaged in quickly depletes his resources. Having his resources now depleted, the son, due to conditions that are beyond his control, that is a famine that comes upon the land, he finds himself now in need of having to hire himself out as an indentured servant to a citizen of that country. So now his options are very limited. He has no real self-determination. He is, for all intents and purposes, a slave to that citizen of the far country. And he is not being shown that gracious attention that he is so used to. In verse 14 to 17 we read, "And when he," that is the son, "when he had spent all that he had, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. And he went and he joined himself to a citizen of that far country. And he," that is the citizen, "sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he desired to have his belly filled with the husk that the swine did eat. And no man gave to him. And when he had came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to eat and to spare? And here I am perishing with hunger." See, the son begins to consider his conditions, and he begins to think about his father's household. He begins to think about all that he had in that relationship back at his father's household. And he realizes that he has squandered his resources, squandered all that had been given to him, all that his father bequeathed to him by having himself declared legally dead. Yet this son wasted it all and ends up feeding swine in the field. And he begins to think about it. He begins to consider his life and the condition that he's in, and he begins to see his state for exactly what it is. And he begins to think about going home. You see, what happens is the son wakes up, literally, and realizes, for all intents and purposes, that he is dead. He literally wakes up dead, realizing his life is dead. Prodigal son then begins to feel a longing for his father's household. And he then determines to go home. And he conceives this idea. He conceives this idea that he would develop a script, words that he would approach his father with, that he hopes his father will then extend to him readmittance back into his household. So the son begins to create this pre-planned script, and he begins to rehearse it because he thinks that's what his father needs to hear. He hopes that when he approaches his father with his prepared and rehearsed script, that his father will reinstate him, even if it is but to be a servant in the household. Because you see, he now believes that his place as a son is in question. In verse 18, the son says, I will rise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no more worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and he came to his father. You see, he begins to look at his life and he feels worthless. He feels that he's lost his status as a son of his father. And he prepares to face his father. But we see in his preparation to face his father and the pre-prepared script that he develops that he has a very distorted view of his father. You see, this is what he thinks his father needs to hear. You see, he thinks his father needs to hear some sort of recount of all the bad decisions that he has made in his life. But we'll see so shortly that he has a distorted view of his father. But in this view, this distorted view, he heads home to his father's household. When the son makes his choice and starts for home, he is unsure as to how his father will receive him. Yet, when he arrives home, when he gets near the family home, the reception is beyond the prodigal son's expectations. You see, the father's eyes have long been watching for his return. You see, he was hoping that his pre-planned script would incline his father's heart to him, but yet we find that the father's heart has always been inclined to his son. His son, in spite of what he believes within his own heart, his father loves him, wants him, and includes him, and has never once for a moment stopped loving him. You see, his sonship was never in question except in his own mind. His father never for a moment stopped considering him a son. In verse 20, we read, But when he, that is the son, but when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. You see, his father was always watching and longing and waiting for his son to return home. He was watching for him. You see, his father's heart was always inclined to him, always welcoming him home, always including him in his love. You see, he ran to his son when he was still a far distance away. You see, the Father wanted His Son to be the Son He was always intended to be within His household. And when the Father runs to meet His Son, when He runs to meet Him and is embraced by His Father, and He begins to recite His pre-planned script that He thought His Father needed to hear, His Father takes absolutely no notice of it. Takes no notice of it. He just simply welcomes Him home. Verse 21, it says, "And then the Son said to the Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no more worthy to be called your son. But," we read, "but the Father said to His servants, bring forth the best robe and put it on Him, and bring a ring to put on His finger, and shoes on His feet." You see, He's giving Him full status as a son. His Father takes no notice of His Son's recounting all his mistakes in life. You see, he had a distorted notion of his Father. He thought his Father needed to hear this recount. But his Father loves him and wants him and includes him and welcomes him home. He doesn't hold his Son's mistakes over his head nor punishes him. He opens his arms and he embraces him. He welcomes him home where he belongs. And then he celebrates. It says, the Father says, "And bring here the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this son was dead and is now alive, was lost and is now found." And they began to be merry. You see, this is how the Father reacted when the Son came home. He gave him full sonship. There was no conditions. His love was for his Son, his heart ever inclined towards him. He paid no attention to his Son's rehearsed script. He was always welcome home. His Father doesn't berate him, belittle him, renounce him in any way. He simply embraces him and graciously extends to him that sonship that has always been his. He places the robe, the ring on his hand, and the shoes on his feet.